What is so wonderful with Bach's music is that every note has a meaning, a place, and an order. And I mean, when you play 16th notes by 4 on the piano, let's say first partita, fa fa re si la si re fa si re si re fa sol mi si la si. You have a flow of notes, but in each group of 4 16th notes, and that is so inspiring for pianists or keyboardists who would play it, as I like to think of the solo cello or solo violin sonatas, suite of dances or suites for dances on the cello solo Bach wrote, and on the piano keyboard he calls them partitas. But the point is is that it's so important to share this with the musicians, that in the group of 4 16th notes he has two at least which are the harmony, the chords in arpeggio spread, one which is the melodic note, fa fa so sol la la si si, rising, re si mi si fa re. The second and third are the harmonic production, which combined sounds a chord, even if it's arpeggio, fa fa re si la si re fa la re fa sol. And then you have, of course, another note out of the four, which is the bass note, or the bass line note rather, would be the basso continuo. But all that is embedded in a single group of four notes, which can be played as they're written, one after the other. But in fact, they're combined, they're resonating, they're meant to play an intuitive combination where they just appear to hold enough to hold together for a harmonization of the arpeggio, and then they sort of like vanish and give room to the next. Of course, it depends on the acoustics of the place where you play, essentially. Did Bach intend to verticalize the group of notes in order to create out of a single suite of 16th notes a combination of a tonal note, a melodic note, a harmonic two notes? And how will we playing it on the piano? Will we separate them? Will we play them with accents? Of course not. It's going to sound like jazz, which is not the point for Bach. I think for Bach, the idea is that the listener, by intelligence or by suggestion of the performer, may I add, in this case mostly, that's what I teach informed students to do, you suggest both. And take an example, the first prelude of the well-tempered clavier, the left hand holds the do and the mi, the C and the E, and then the GCE, or sol do mi, the arpeggio in the right hand are unheld. They're just in succession. And if you play do mi sol, C, E, G, the first three, which are bleeding over, as they call it in harpsichord, staying, resonating, regardless how long, according to the acoustic and the instrument of the harpsichord here and there, you obtain something amazing. You obtain a legato and an articulated tororom pom 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 pom, tororom pom 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 pom. The first G major solo cello suite, qui does sol re si la si re sol re si la si re sol mi do mi sol mi do mi. So you have the ostinato on the sol on the G, you have re si for the triad D B in a tenth, and then you have a decorative, elegant, suggested single neighboring tone, which is the A, si, la, si. That sounds like rhythmized, slow motion, low note mordant. Si, la, si, do, re, do, re. And you hear it in an acoustical room, especially since Bach uses very wisely the empty strings, so you can hear sol, re, si, resonate even more. You obtain a harmonization and then a melodization and a decoration all in one. Talk about practical, talk about minimal usage for maximal effect. Of course, unlike the solo monodic instruments that are violin, for which he wrote as well fugues in his sonatas for violin solo, like the first one in in Sol minor, G minor. Ré, 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 do, si, do, la, si, sol, ré, sol, la, fa, mi, ré, 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 sa, 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 fa, mi, fa, ré, ré, sol, do, si, la, si, do, fa, ré, fa sharp, ré, ré, ré. I don't know how to sing the fa sharp. Obviously, I shouldn't sing because I don't know how to sing. But it's fascinating that you have a fugue for a solo instrument that is originally a melodic instrument, monodic instrument. Obviously, you arpeggiate, obviously, you play some double stops, obviously, you play around the ways of suggesting the different voices up to 3, 4 even. Sol, re, si, fa, re, mi, do, do. And so I was thinking when I was teaching today the first partita in the allemande. Fa, fa, re, si, la, si, re, fa, la, re, fa, sol, mi, si, la, si, mi, sol, mi, sol, la. We can suggest on the different touches of the piano, which is tenuto, which is accented, which is legato, which is articulato, if it existed, or staccato. Staccato is dangerous because staccato adds to the character, it becomes funny. Detached or legato is a breath, a bowing, a way to punctuate a change of ball direction. I think that staccato is dangerous to manipulate on the piano because it's a particularly powerful instrument for the staccatos because of the hammers and the dampers. So you hear pop, 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 then it triggers a character change. Whenever Bach's music is more, I wouldn't say characterless because that's not the point. Of course, he's depicting stylized dances in these suites for solo keyboard, solo violin, solo cello. I wonder to which extent he wanted them to be characterized or pure music. Obviously, they're not meant to be played for dancers. They're stylized dances evoked on a solo instrument. And the dances in the Baroque were a completely different factor than today, obviously. They were societal elitism, courtship, court dancing, and the chronology of the learning, the choreography of the learning, all these things were very, very, it was an etiquette. It was all completely not improvised, far away from there. So it could be that because it's popular and that possibly on the harpsichord you could have practiced your steps if you were invited to the court and wanted to do good impression that you know how to dance, and the steps mostly, that you could have practiced with the harpsichord playing. That's possible. I assume it was done. Of course, today in the 21st century, it seems like we are playing those dances as an evocation of an ancient dance that we don't dance. Except, of course, specialized groups in Baroque dance, which is fascinating to watch on YouTube because it's amazing how well they penetrate the steps, the knowledge, the gestures, the outfits, the general behavior. It's not just steps, it's the culture of it. It's a lost art combined to the evocation of it on the harpsichord, on the piano. So you have all these translation filters through the year, the centuries. So do they talk to us as pure music? Do they talk to us as stylized dances? I'm not quite sure of that. I personally think that we approach them more for the pure music that they are. The intervals, the gestures, the leaps, the melodic line, every different aspect of each 16th note that connects dots between 16th notes for the melody fa sol sol la la si, for the harmony re si mi si fa si, and for the bass line re si re mi fa. So you obtain something dislocated, put together. It sounds like a puzzle. And if you play it all even and unconnected or undisconnected, you seem to avoid it entirely. You just play the notes. You recite fa fa re si la si re fa sol mi si la si mi so si mi si mi so la mi do si la do mi la si. What's the point, right? I think it's interesting to see to which extent you can convince your student, as I try, by conviction really, to bring out the different aspects of the symbolisms of each of the notes, with the melodic connected notes through the groups of 16th notes, so they're like dots that you put together beyond the rests, and then the harmonization notes with a different articulation. So you can have a tenuto on the melody notes and air legato on the 16th notes of the arpeggiated chordal progressions, and then a tenuto of a solid tenuto for the bass line. And all of these notes are spread over 4 beats. It's not like they're holding or they are connected. They are sort of spread around. And it's a difficult aesthetic choice for me to define for the student how much to separate their articulations and therefore to fragment the groupments of 4/16 notes by their different aesthetic and necessity, melodic, harmonic, or rhythmic, or just let it appear by itself and play them even and say the listener will catch. To a certain extent, today's aesthetic of authenticity and minimalist structure on publishers who compare the most possible authentic copies of students and so on and so forth in Bach, they come up with something that they consider being closest to the authenticity. So if we start energizing it in the interpretation with different colorizations of the articulation, dynamics, shadow and lights, chiaroscuro, and then make it more, in a way, evocative of some function combined with the other notes, then all of a sudden becomes 3D and we feel like we're hearing something played on an orchestra, an organ, with imaginary held sounds, acoustically or just because of the change of dynamics or the change of articulation. You play non-legato, air legato, legato, connected, overlapped. Perhaps even a tiny bit of rubato if you delay some important punctuation note. So much to do, so much to suggest, so much to not overstate. So between suggest and overstate, I have to convince my students which is the right thing to do, because it's not written in the score. It's what we read between the lines, between the notes, how we organize their bundle, how we organize their statement, how we organize their direction, their line, their finality, if you want. So at which point is it too much demonstration and how much we need to hold back and perhaps do faded colors rather than they're very, striking colors. It's difficult. I have an aesthetic doubt that I don't want to overwhelm the student with this knowledge, but at the same time, I feel like it's respecting the student to give them the option and say, hey, these are what symbolically these notes combined can represent. Does it mean that Bach wanted it like this? Of course we don't know. Bach never heard the modern piano. So perhaps for him the sounds are too long, they don't decay fast enough. This kind of incredible temptation of the ephemeral disappearance of the sounds that just appear harmonized in an ephemeral moment of a half a beat. And then combined with the next ephemeral beat, combined they become a progression that you guess by the dots, in between the dots. It's fascinating. It really is. But I still think that the student will ultimately choose how much of what to show, how much of what to display, how much of what to try to display, regardless if they're convinced or not. And perhaps they'll be convinced later, and perhaps they're half convinced now. I don't have a way to say this is what Bach wanted, as if I have any authenticity stamp to put over it. No, I don't. I have the curiosity, I have the love for it, I have the excitement that it produces on me, the jubilant marvelment about how many things he can suggest in so few notes. And perhaps I see too much into it. Sometimes I'm fearing that. It's probably like people who are so in love, they idealize the object of their love, perhaps beyond what the person is or becomes or whatever. It's possibly the same thing in music. When you love a piece so much, you end up by wanting it to be what you wish it to be, more than what it was intended to be, perhaps, by the composer. Then comes the aesthetics about choosing what is the range of choice of the interpreter compared to a composer, compared to, let's say, a scholar musicologist, and how do we define when is too much, when is not enough, when is right, what is juste, right? I find that probably an unanswerable question overall. I think that what is marvelous in the notation is that it suggests a lot of the intent of the composer, but in our playing, we bring it alive. I think we complete it. Perhaps we deviant, we go elsewhere than what it was intended by the composer. First of all, I don't think composers in the past, at least Baroque past 18th century, would have thought of interpretation as a separate element to their piece. I think writing was it. Playing the writing, since everybody played the writing of the day with the people of the day, they didn't have to define the style. What is Baroque style? They didn't even know they were in the Baroque style. They were just doing what was customary to do. Play the violin, the organ, the whatever, the church music, the secular music. And so it was more about styles, or perhaps not even, just habits or fashions, most likely. And it was within their own context. Very little knowledge of the music of their past for lack of access. Of course, no knowledge of where music went after them, which is scary to imagine that they would even think of it. Hopefully not, because that would mentally disturb them probably a lot. And we have today the capacity to revisit all these time periods on an instrument that's not connected to the authenticity of the time, but that can be universally expressive if you use it in a ways that expresses the stylistic defined by you or your teacher, I guess, or your friends or your mentors or your admired performers. If you have a recital, you play Scarlatti, and then you play, I don't know, Beethoven, Schumann, and Scriabin on the piano. Obviously, it's a universal instrument if it can render, regardless if betraying music written not for it. But at the same time, the opposite is impossible. A harpsichord cannot play Rachmaninoff because it's not meant to. A fortepiano, neither. They play the music written for their instrument, and the harpsichords specifically according to their countries and their styles and their tunings. So it's not a harpsichord, it's many. It's not an organ, it's many organs in terms of conception, instrumentation, style, genre, articulation, sound, projection, and the music written for it, corresponding for it, which expresses itself best through it. The French clavecinist, the Dutch harpsichordists, the English virginalists, the German, the Bohemian, the Austrian, and then the fortepianos, and which type and which developments of which technology, which pedaling, which cross stringing compared to the straight strings. And at every point you had music written for those instruments and music played from these instruments on other instruments. And today we seem to still want to hope that when you hear a recital of this various type of styles and time periods on a single instrument, the culture of the performer will suggest them in their playing, in their touch. A mezzo forte in Schubert shouldn't be a mezzo forte in Scriabin, or if not in the touch, perhaps in the attack, in the way of touching it, in the way of delaying it, in the way of prolonging it, and the pedal or not, and the una corda or not, or when, or the middle pedal, if you can enhance some of the polyphony through the part hold, part not hold of the keyboard. Of course, it's another moral problem, because then perhaps it's a strong word, but still, it is aesthetic at least. Most of the composers who wrote polyphonically didn't have a middle pedal. They imagined it even if it was unplayable on their instruments per se, other than suggested, which was perhaps the way it was supposed to intended to be. Oh, I cannot share enough with you my excitement. Perhaps it's not my excitement, it's my enmarvelment, my perhaps also impatience. At almost 60, I should have known by now all these things. I shouldn't still want to discover them and define them. But it seems like it's an endless journey. The journey is the destination, as the architects of some of the famous philosophers would say. Not sure I'm convinced for that, because it's sort of disappointing. Oh, I know. People like to think that they know enough, that it's everything in stone, and they just deliver it, and the students just receive it, and that's it. One-way street. It's for some things possible, but for other things, I think the intuition of the students inspires the knowledge of the teachers to question themselves. Takes humility to rethink the paradigm. But there are things that you're convinced in, either because of your teachers or your experiences. There's nothing wrong with that. I don't try to be psycho-rigid, nor without any opinion. I try to be open while convinced. It's kind of an impossible combination, I guess. And I don't think I can be convincing to the student unless I give them a translation of my understanding through my playing. The examples help, perhaps sometimes too much to make the point. But you live only once, so you want to find ways to connect, to convey, to express, and see what they're going to do with it is in their hands anyway. It's not in mine. But I'm eager to give them all the grains that can grow in their garden of thoughts and that will blossom when they will need it most. Even if they might not adopt it now or reject it in part, regardless, it's a long journey long, not relatively long, but appears to be long, decades of traveling with the musical companionship of these pieces. I think it's unbelievably exciting and humbling.